The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked earth of what folks in Copper Creek called the most worthless spread in 3 counties. Jake Morrison stood on the sagging porch of his newly acquired shack, squinting at the barren landscape that stretched endlessly before him. $50, every last cent he had to his name, had bought him 800 acres of dust, rocks, and broken dreams. "You're a damn fool, Morrison," he muttered to himself, the same words his late wife Sarah would have said if she'd lived to see this day. But Sarah was 6 months in the ground, along with their modest savings that had gone to pay the doctor bills. The bank had taken their home in Denver, and Jake had nothing left but his pride, his horse, and now this God-forsaken patch of earth that nobody else wanted. The previous owner, a grizzled prospector named Ezekiel Harrow, had practically begged Jake to take it off his hands. "Land's got potential," the old man had wheezed, his rheumy eyes avoiding Jake's gaze. "Just ain't had the right man to work it proper." Then he'd disappeared into the desert with his $50, leaving behind nothing but a ramshackle cabin and a hand-drawn map that showed property lines and little else. Jake's gelding, Buck, snorted and pawed at the hard-pan soil near the well. The horse had been restless since they'd arrived 3 days ago, constantly testing his tether and gazing toward the eastern ridge where a cluster of weathered rocks formed what looked like an ancient cairn. Maybe the animal sensed something Jake couldn't. Animals often did. The nearest neighbor was Tom Bradley's spread, 5 miles south, where green pastures and fat cattle proved that water and good sense could make a man prosper in this country. Bradley had ridden over yesterday, ostensibly to welcome Jake, but really to satisfy his curiosity about the fool who'd bought Harrow's cursed land. Ezekiel Harrow was a strange bird, Bradley had said, leaning against his saddle horn. Lived out here nigh on 20 years, always digging holes and muttering about secrets. Most folks figured the desert sun had addled his brains. "You might want to think about selling to me. I'd give you 60 for it, just to keep my cattle from wandering over here and breaking their legs in whatever holes the old coot dug." But Jake wasn't ready to admit defeat, not yet. He'd been a mining engineer before the silver played out in Colorado, and he knew something about reading land that others might miss. There had to be a reason Harrow had hung on to this place for 2 decades, scratching out a living that barely kept him in beans and coffee. That afternoon, Jake decided to explore the eastern ridge where Buck kept looking. The climb was steeper than it appeared from the cabin, and the sun beat down mercilessly on his shoulders. Halfway up, he found the first of Harrow's excavations, a pit maybe 6 feet deep, carved into solid rock with hand tools. The effort it must have taken was staggering. At the top of the ridge, Jake found something that made him pause. The cairn he'd seen from below wasn't natural at all. Someone had arranged the stones in a deliberate pattern, almost like an arrow, pointing toward a depression in the rock face. Kneeling beside it, Jake noticed that the depression had been artificially widened, chiseled out with painstaking care. Inside the hollow, wrapped in oiled canvas that had protected it from decades of weather, Jake found a leather journal. His hands trembled as he opened it to the first page, written in Ezekiel Harrow's spidery handwriting. "If you're reading this, then I'm dead and gone, and this land has passed to someone else. Pray to God it's someone with more sand and sense, because what's buried here will take both to claim." Jake's heart hammered as he read on. Harrow had been a Confederate soldier during the war, part of a detail tasked with moving a shipment of gold coins from a captured Union payroll train. But as Sherman's army closed in, the detail had been ambushed by Union cavalry. All the soldiers had died except Harrow, who'd managed to bury the strongbox before crawling away to die. Only he hadn't died. Took me 19 years to find this place again, the journal continued. The landmarks had changed, memories played tricks, but I never gave up. Found the box in 1884, buried 12 feet down in a dry creek bed that's now nothing but hardpan. 40,000 in double eagles, still bright as the day they were minted. Jake's hands shook as he turned the page. $40,000 in gold coins, enough to buy half the territory and still have money left over for the finest ranch in Colorado. But where was it now? The gold's safe, Harrow had written, safer than any bank, hidden where the desert will guard it until the right man comes along. Follow the morning star from the eagle's perch, count your steps, and remember that water always finds the lowest place. The rest of the journal contained cryptic references to landmarks that meant nothing to Jake. The Weeping Stone, the Devil's Gate, the place where shadows dance at noon. It was maddening, like having a treasure map written in a language he couldn't quite understand. As the sun began to set, Jake carefully rewrapped the journal and made his way back down the ridge. His mind raced with possibilities and questions. If Harrow had found the gold in 1884, why was he still living like a pauper when he sold the land? Had he moved it, hidden it again, or was this all the fevered imagination of a sun-addled prospector? That night, Jake barely slept. Every shadow outside his window looked like a prowler. Every sound made him reach for the old Colt revolver he kept by his bedside. If word got out about Harrow's journal, every treasure hunter and desperado in the territory would descend on his land like locusts. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Jake was brewing coffee over his small fire when hoofbeats announced someone's approach. Through the window, he saw a tall man in a black coat riding a magnificent stallion, not the sort of horse an honest cowpoke could afford. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace and walked toward the cabin with his hands visible, but never far from the matched Colts on his hips. Jake had seen enough gunfighters to recognize the breed, and this one carried himself like a man who'd never lost a contest of speed. "Mornin'," the stranger called out, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Name's Carson Blackwood. Heard tell you bought this place from old Ezekiel Harrow." Jake stepped onto the porch, keeping his own hand near his weapon. "News travels fast in empty country. What's your interest in my land, Mr. Blackwood?" Blackwood smiled, but it didn't reach his pale eyes. "Let's just say I had some unfinished business with Harrow. Man owed me a considerable debt, and now that he's gone, I figure his obligations pass to whoever bought his holdings. I bought the land, not his debts." Jake kept his voice steady, though his pulse quickened. "Got a bill of sale that says this spread is mine, clear and simple." "Oh, I'm not talking about money, friend." Blackwood's hand drifted toward his gun butt. "Harrow had something that belonged to me. Something he took during an unfortunate misunderstanding some years back. I aim to collect it, one way or another." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a grass fire. Jake realized with crystalline clarity that Blackwood knew about the gold, or at least suspected its existence. Maybe Harrow hadn't been as secretive as he thought. Maybe there were others who remembered the Confederate detail and the missing payroll. "I don't know what you're talking about," Jake said carefully. "Man sold me empty land and took himself elsewhere. If he had something of yours, he took it with him." Blackwood studied Jake's face with the intensity of a hawk watching a rabbit. After a long moment, he nodded slowly. "Could be you're telling the truth. Could be you just haven't found it yet. Either way, I'll be keeping an eye on this place. If anything interesting turns up, I expect you to remember who asked first." He mounted his stallion with the same fluid grace and rode away without another word. But Jake knew the gunfighter would be back. Men like Blackwood didn't make idle threats, and they sure as hell didn't ride away from $40,000 in gold without a fight. As the dust from Blackwood's departure settled, Jake realized his simple plan to start over on worthless land had just become a deadly game. Somewhere on his property lay a fortune in gold coins, and at least one very dangerous man knew it. The question was whether Jake could find the treasure before Blackwood lost patience and decided to take the direct approach. Standing on his porch with Harrow's journal hidden in his shirt, Jake Morrison made a decision that would change everything. He was going to find that gold, even if it killed him. After all, a man who'd lost everything had nothing left to lose, and sometimes that made him the most dangerous man of all. The treasure hunt was about to begin in earnest. Jake spent the next 2 days studying Harrow's journal until he could recite every cryptic passage from memory. The old prospector had possessed a peculiar mind, encoding his secrets in riddles that seemed designed to frustrate anyone lacking intimate knowledge of the land. But gradually, patterns began to emerge from the seemingly random observations. Follow the morning star from the eagle's perch had stumped Jake initially, until he realized that morning star referred to Venus, visible just before dawn in the eastern sky. The eagle's perch had to be the ridge where he'd found the journal, the highest point on his property, where a bird of prey might survey its territory. At first light on the 3rd day, Jake positioned himself at the cairn and sighted along the path Venus would take as it rose. The line led directly toward a shallow canyon he hadn't yet explored, carved into the landscape by flash floods over countless centuries. He paced off the distance, counting carefully, 237 steps to the canyon's mouth. The canyon walls rose maybe 20 feet on either side, carved from red sandstone that had been sculpted by wind and water into fantastic shapes. About 50 yards in, Jake found what had to be the Weeping Stone, a natural formation where groundwater seeped through the rock face and left dark stains that looked like tears running down weathered cheeks. According to the journal, he needed to find the place where shadows dance at noon somewhere near the Weeping Stone. Jake spent an hour studying the canyon walls, looking for anything that might cast unusual shadows when the sun reached its zenith. Finally, he noticed a series of holes carved into the rock face, not natural caves, but deliberate excavations that would create moving patterns of light and shadow as the sun passed overhead. The holes formed a rough circle around a flat area at the canyon's base, an ancient campsite where someone had once built fires and left behind blackened stones. Jake knelt and began brushing away decades of accumulated sand and debris. 3 feet down, his fingers struck something hard and metallic. It was an iron ring set into what appeared to be a stone slab. Jake's heart pounded as he cleared away more sand, revealing a carefully fitted capstone that had been designed to look like natural rock. This had to be it, Harrow's hiding place for the Confederate gold. But as Jake prepared to lift the stone, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. He quickly covered his excavation and scrambled up the nearest wall, finding a shallow cave where he could observe without being seen. Carson Blackwood rode into the canyon accompanied by 2 other men who had the look of hired guns about them. One was a giant Mexican with gold teeth and crossed bandoliers. The other, a wiry individual whose pale skin suggested he was more comfortable in saloons than under the desert sun. "Spread out and look for fresh digging," Blackwood commanded. "Morrison's been busy these past few days, and a man doesn't buy worthless land unless he knows something others don't." The Mexican, who Blackwood called Vega, dismounted and began examining the canyon floor with the skill of an experienced tracker. It wouldn't take him long to find the disturbed sand around the stone slab. Jake cursed silently and checked his revolver, knowing he was outgunned 3-1, but unwilling to let $40,000 slip away without a fight. "Patron," Vega called out in accented English, "someone has been digging here, very recent." Blackwood and the Pale Man hurried over to examine Vega's discovery. Within minutes, they had uncovered the iron ring and were preparing to lift the stone slab. Jake realized with sick certainty that if he let them open Harrow's cache, he'd never see a penny of the gold, assuming they didn't simply kill him to eliminate a witness. Making a decision born of desperation, Jake drew his Colt and fired a shot that ricocheted off the canyon wall near Blackwood's feet. The three men dove for cover, drawing their own weapons as they tried to locate the source of the shot. "That's my land you're digging on," Jake called out from his hiding place. "I suggest you mount up and ride away before this gets ugly." Blackwood's laugh echoed off the canyon walls. "Morrison, shoulda known you'd be skulking around somewhere. Why don't you come down here and we'll discuss this like civilized men?" "Nothing civilized about what you're planning," Jake replied, keeping his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "I know what you are, Blackwood, and I know what you want, but that gold stays where it is until I say otherwise." The admission hung in the desert air like a challenge. Jake realized he'd just confirmed Blackwood's suspicions about the treasure, but there was no taking back the words now. "So you do know about Harrow's little nest egg," Blackwood said, his tone turning cold. "Makes things simpler, I suppose. Vega, see if you can get a clear shot at our talkative friend up there." The Mexican began working his way up the canyon wall with the agility of a mountain goat. Jake fired another shot, forcing Vega to take cover, but he knew it was only a matter of time before the man found a position where he could use his rifle effectively. The Pale Man, meanwhile, had begun lifting the stone slab. It was heavy work, but Jake could see the corner beginning to rise. In minutes, they would have access to whatever lay beneath, and Jake would lose his only bargaining chip. Desperation bred inspiration. Jake remembered the flash floods that had carved this canyon and how desert arroyos could fill with rushing water in minutes when storms struck the distant mountains. The morning had been clear, but afternoon thunderheads were building on the northern horizon, the kind of storms that could send a wall of water down a dry wash without warning. "Blackwood," Jake called out, "you might want to think twice about camping in that canyon bottom. Weather's looking changeable, and this whole wash drains half the territory when it rains." "Nice try, Morrison," Blackwood replied. But Jake noticed he glanced nervously at the canyon walls. Every man who'd lived in the desert for long had stories about flash floods, and the smart ones learned to respect the danger. The Pale Man had managed to lift the stone slab several inches, revealing a dark cavity beneath. Jake could see his excitement even from a distance. Whatever was down there, it was worth the effort they'd invested. That's when Jake heard it, a low rumble from the north, like distant thunder, but deeper and more sustained. The sound grew rapidly stronger, accompanied by a rushing noise that every desert dweller learned to fear. Flash flood. "Vega!" Blackwood shouted, suddenly understanding the danger. "Get down from there! Everybody to high ground, now!" The Mexican abandoned his attempt to reach Jake and began scrambling toward the canyon rim. The Pale Man let the stone slab fall back into place and ran for his horse. But Blackwood hesitated, torn between self-preservation and the $40,000 that lay just beneath his feet. The water hit the canyon like a brown avalanche, carrying logs, boulders, and debris in a churning mass that would crush anything in its path. Jake pressed himself deeper into his cave as the flood roared past, 20 feet below and rising fast. When the water receded an hour later, Jake climbed down to survey the damage. The canyon floor had been scoured clean, covered with a fresh layer of sand and silt that effectively buried Harrow's cache again. Blackwood and his men were nowhere to be seen, though Jake found tracks leading away from the canyon rim. They had escaped but lost their immediate access to the gold. As Jake made his way back toward his cabin, he realized the flood had bought him time, but not victory. Blackwood would return with more men and better equipment, and eventually he would relocate the buried treasure. Jake needed help, but whom could he trust with the secret of $40,000 in Confederate gold? The answer came to him as he crested the ridge above his property. Tom Bradley was riding toward the cabin, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies. The neighboring rancher had proven himself honest in their brief acquaintance, and Jake found himself desperately hoping that honesty extended to unusual circumstances. "Thought you might be running short on provisions," Bradley called out as Jake approached. "Been watching smoke from your chimney and figured you were still among the living." Jake made a decision that would either save his life or end it. "Tom, I need to tell you something that's going to sound like the ravings of a sun-touched fool, but I'm hoping you're the kind of man who can listen with an open mind." Bradley's weathered face grew serious as he studied Jake's expression. "I've found that the desert makes honest men of most folks, one way or another. What's eating at you, Morrison?" And so, standing in the shadow of the ridge where Ezekiel Harrow had hidden his final secret, Jake Morrison told Tom Bradley about Confederate gold, cryptic journals, and a gunfighter named Carson Blackwood who would kill them both for $40,000. To his credit, Bradley listened without interruption until Jake finished his story. Then the rancher was quiet for a long moment, studying the landscape with new eyes. "Well," Bradley finally said, "I always wondered why old Harrow hung on to this worthless patch of ground for 20 years. 40,000 in gold would explain a lot." He looked directly at Jake. "Question is, what do you aim to do about it?" Jake felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. "I aim to dig up that gold before Blackwood comes back with reinforcements, but I'll need help, and I'll need someone I can trust to watch my back." Bradley nodded slowly. "Count me in, partner. Always figured this territory was big enough for honest men to make their way without interference from gunslinging treasure hunters." He paused, then grinned. "Besides, my curiosity's up now. Want to see if Harrow's story holds water, or if we're both chasing moonbeams." As the two men shook hands, sealing their partnership, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: hope. The treasure was still out there, buried beneath sand and stone in a canyon that had become a temporary lake. Blackwood would be back, probably with more men and heavier guns. But Jake Morrison was no longer a lone prospector with everything to lose. He was part of a team now, and that changed everything. The next morning brought both opportunity and danger in equal measure. Tom Bradley arrived before dawn with two of his most trusted hands: Miguel Santos, a soft-spoken vaquero whose loyalty was absolute, and Frank Carson, a former cavalry sergeant who'd settled in the territory after his army service ended. Both men had proven their worth during Apache raids and cattle rustling incidents, and Bradley vouched for their discretion. "Told him you'd found something valuable that needed protection from claim jumpers," Bradley explained as they gathered around Jake's small fire. "Didn't mention specifics, but they understand the stakes." Jake studied the two newcomers carefully. Santos had the weathered look of a man born to the saddle, his dark eyes missing nothing as he surveyed the surrounding terrain. Carson was built like a prize fighter, with scarred knuckles and the erect posture that marked him as ex-military. Both men had proven their worth during Apache raids and cattle rustling incidents, and Bradley vouched for their discretion. "Told him you'd found something valuable that needed protection from claim jumpers," Bradley explained as they gathered around Jake's small fire. "Didn't mention specifics, but they understand the stakes." Jake studied the two newcomers carefully. Santos had the weathered look of a man born to the saddle, his dark eyes missing nothing as he surveyed the surrounding terrain. Carson was built like a prize fighter, with scarred knuckles and the erect posture that marked him as ex-military. Both men wore their guns with the easy familiarity of those who'd used them in anger. "The canyon's probably still muddy from yesterday's flood," Jake said, spreading Harrow's hand-drawn map on a flat rock. "But that won't stop determined men from digging. We need to get there first and work fast." "What about Blackwood?" Bradley asked. Man like that doesn't give up easy, especially with that kind of money at stake. Frank Carson spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of long command. Saw 3 riders heading north yesterday evening, moving fast. Looked like they were putting distance between themselves and something unpleasant. Could be your gunfighter friends. Could be, Jake agreed, but I wouldn't bet my life on it. More likely they went to find reinforcements. A man doesn't hire guns like Vega unless he's planning serious trouble. They rode out as the first rays of sunlight painted the eastern mountains gold and crimson. The canyon showed dramatic evidence of the previous day's flood. Scoured walls, fresh debris piles, and a completely transformed floor where sand and silt had buried every trace of human activity. Finding Harrow's cache would require careful measurement and some educated guessing about how the landscape had changed. Jake led them to the weeping stone, still trickling moisture down the canyon wall, and began pacing off distances according to the journal's cryptic instructions. The Devil's Gate, mentioned in Harrow's notes, turned out to be a narrow gap between 2 towering rock formations, aligned perfectly with the rising sun on the spring equinox. From there, 37 paces south led to a depression that matched the journal's description of where water pools in the dry season. "This has to be it," Jake said, kneeling beside what appeared to be solid rock, but felt hollow when struck with a rifle butt. "Help me clear away this sand." The 5 men worked with controlled urgency, knowing that every minute increased the risk of discovery by hostile forces. 2 feet down, they encountered the stone slab that Blackwood's men had briefly exposed before the flood interrupted their efforts. The iron ring was still there, green with age, but solidly embedded in the capstone. "Heavy as a coffin lid," Miguel grunted as they prepared to lift the slab. "Whatever's down there, someone wanted it to stay put." With all 5 men pulling, the capstone finally shifted and revealed a carefully excavated chamber lined with fitted stones. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of oiled canvas, sat an iron strongbox that had survived decades of burial without significant corrosion. Jake's hands trembled as he cleared away the protective wrapping and revealed the catch that held the box closed. "Moment of truth," Bradley murmured. "Either we're about to be rich men, or we've just spent a morning digging up Harrow's collection of worthless rocks." The strongbox opened with a rusty squeal that seemed to echo through the canyon like a gunshot. Inside, nested in rotted velvet, lay row upon row of gold double eagles, more wealth than any of them had ever seen in one place. The coins caught the morning sunlight and threw it back in dazzling flashes that hurt the eyes to look at directly. Frank Carson whistled softly. "Well, I'll be damned. Never thought I'd live to see real Confederate treasure." "Union treasure, actually," Jake corrected, lifting one of the coins to examine the eagle and shield design. "These were taken from a federal payroll train, according to Harrow's journal. Makes them legal salvage, as far as I'm concerned." Miguel Santos crossed himself and muttered a prayer in Spanish. 40,000 in gold, enough to buy half of Texas and still have money left over. Enough to attract every desperado and claim jumper between here and California, Bradley added grimly. "We need to get this moved before word spreads." They were preparing to lift the strongbox when the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed through the canyon. Frank Carson spun and fell, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. From positions along the canyon rim, muzzle flashes marked the locations of at least 6 shooters. "Well, well," Carson Blackwood's voice drifted down from above. "Looks like you boys found what I was looking for. Much obliged for doing the hard work." Jake drew his Colt and fired upward, more to provide cover than with any hope of hitting a target. The return volley sent bullets spanging off the rocks around them and forced the treasure hunters to take shelter behind the largest boulders they could find. "You're surrounded, Morrison," Blackwood called out. "No way out of that canyon except through my men. Might as well make this easy on yourselves." "Go to hell," Jake shouted back. though he knew their position was hopeless. Blackwood had learned from his previous mistake and positioned his forces where the flash flood couldn't reach them. This time, he held all the advantages. Miguel Santos proved he was more than just a simple vaquero. Moving with the fluid grace of a man who'd fought Apaches, he worked his way to a position where he could see one of the shooters above. His rifle spoke once, and a scream echoed through the canyon as one of Blackwood's men toppled from his perch. 5 left, Santos reported calmly, already moving to a new position before return fire could find him. Tom Bradley had positioned himself where he could watch the main approach to their location. "Someone's coming down the trail," he warned. "Looks like they're tired of waiting for us to surrender." Jake realized that staying put meant certain death. Blackwood would eventually work his way down into the canyon, and when that happened, the treasure hunters would be caught in a crossfire with no hope of escape. Their only chance lay in creating enough confusion to break out of the trap. "Frank, can you travel?" Jake asked the wounded ex-sergeant. Carson grimaced, but nodded. "Bullet went clean through." "Hurts like hell, but I can ride." "Then here's what we're gonna do," Jake said, forming a desperate plan. "Miguel, keep them busy from this position. Tom, you and Frank work your way toward that side canyon we passed coming in. I'm going to create a distraction that should draw their attention." "What kind of distraction?" Bradley asked suspiciously. Jake hefted the strongbox, surprised by its weight, but determined to see his plan through. "The kind that involves $40,000 in gold and a man who's got nothing left to lose." Before anyone could stop him, Jake broke cover and ran toward the narrow gap between the rock formations, the Devil's Gate that had helped him locate the treasure in the first place. Bullets whined around him like angry hornets, but the awkward shape of the strongbox made him an erratic target. "Blackwood!" Jake shouted as he reached temporary shelter. "You want this gold? Come and take it from me, you yellow-bellied snake!" The insult had its intended effect. Jake heard Blackwood cursing his men and demanding they stop shooting at the strongbox. Apparently, the gunfighter was worried about damaging his prize, a concern that gave Jake the few seconds he needed to implement the most dangerous gamble of his life. The Devil's Gate opened onto a narrow ledge that ran along the canyon wall about 15 feet above the floor. It was barely wide enough for one man, but it led toward a chimney formation that might provide a way to the canyon rim. Jake began working his way along the ledge, using the strongbox as both shield and bait to keep Blackwood's attention focused on him. "You're just making this harder on yourself, Morrison," Blackwood called out. His voice was closer now, suggesting he was indeed coming down into the canyon. "Drop that box, and we might let you live long enough to regret crossing me." Jake's response was to keep climbing, though his muscles screamed in protest, and the strongbox seemed to gain weight with every step. Behind him, he could hear the continuing firefight as Miguel and the others fought to break out of the trap. A man screamed. Whether friend or foe, Jake couldn't tell. Halfway up the chimney, disaster struck. A loose rock gave way under Jake's foot, and he found himself dangling by one hand while the strongbox threatened to pull him into empty space. For a terrifying moment, he considered letting the treasure fall. $40,000 was worthless to a dead man. But then he thought about Sarah, about the new life he was trying to build, about the honest men who'd risked their lives to help him. With a surge of strength born from desperation, Jake hauled himself back onto the narrow ledge and continued climbing. "Son of a bitch is getting away!" someone shouted from below. More gunfire erupted, closer now, and Jake felt stone chips sting his face as bullets chewed at the rock around him. The top of the chimney opened onto a flat area that connected to the main canyon rim through a series of natural steps. Jake was perhaps 20 yards from safety when Carson Blackwood appeared at the base of the chimney, his pale eyes blazing with fury. "End of the line, Morrison," the gunfighter snarled, raising his rifle. "Should have taken my generous offer when you had the chance." Jake set down the strongbox and drew his Colt, knowing he was outgunned but unwilling to surrender without a fight. The two men faced each other across 20 feet of empty space, and in that moment, Jake understood that everything, his life, his future, his chance at redemption, came down to who could draw and fire faster. "Nothing personal," Blackwood said, and went for his gun. But Jake Morrison had been thinking about this moment for days, visualizing it, preparing for it. His Colt cleared leather a fraction of a second before Blackwood's rifle came to bear, and in the crystal-clear instant before he fired, Jake saw surprise flicker across the gunfighter's face. The shot echoed through the canyon like thunder. Blackwood staggered backward, his rifle spinning away into empty space, and toppled from the ledge with a scream that ended abruptly against the rocks below. Jake holstered his weapon with hands that shook only slightly. In the sudden silence, he could hear voices from the canyon floor, his friends calling his name, asking if he was all right. The surviving members of Blackwood's gang had apparently decided that $40,000 wasn't worth facing the guns of determined men who'd proven they could shoot back. As Jake picked up the strongbox and began making his way down to rejoin his partners, he realized that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet fully comprehend. He was no longer a broke rancher with nothing to lose. He was a wealthy man with everything to protect, and that would bring challenges he'd never anticipated. But for now, it was enough to be alive, to have friends he could trust, and to know that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys actually won. 3 months later, Jake Morrison sat on the porch of his new ranch house, watching the sun set over green pastures where his cattle grazed contentedly. The worthless land had been transformed through hard work, careful irrigation, and the judicious application of Confederate gold to make necessary improvements. Tom Bradley rode up the lane leading 2 saddled horses, a ritual they'd established for their evening tours of the combined properties. The 2 men had become true partners, pooling their resources and expertise to create something neither could have achieved alone. "Miguel's got the south herd settled for the night," Bradley reported, dismounting and accepting the cup of coffee Jake offered. "Says those new bulls are already improving the bloodline. Frank thinks we'll be ready for the cattle drive to Kansas City come spring." Jake nodded, still sometimes amazed by how quickly his circumstances had changed. The gold had been quietly converted through banks in Denver and Kansas City, transformed from Confederate coins into legitimate business capital that no one could question. A portion had gone to Miguel Santos and Frank Carson as their shares of the treasure, enough to set both men up as independent ranchers if they chose. Instead, they'd decided to stay on as partners in the growing operation. "Any word from town about our friend Blackwood?" Jake asked, though he was fairly certain he knew the answer. "Sheriff confirmed what we already figured," Bradley replied. "Carson Blackwood was wanted in 3 territories for murder, robbery, and claim jumping. Territories offering a $500 reward for whoever put him down. You interested in collecting?" Jake shook his head. "Money we don't need and questions we don't want to answer. Let sleeping dogs lie." They rode out across the range as the last light faded from the western sky, checking on herds and water sources with the automatic attention of men whose livelihood depended on such details. The land that had once seemed worthless now supported nearly 2,000 head of cattle, a growing remuda of quality horses, and improvements that would have been impossible without Ezekiel Harrow's buried treasure. "Ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't bought this place?" Bradley asked as they paused at the top of the ridge where Jake had first found Harrow's journal. "Every day," Jake admitted. "Funny how one decision can change everything. If I'd listened to common sense and stayed in Denver, begging for work in the mines, you'd have starved to death or frozen to death, whichever came first," Bradley finished. "Sometimes a man's gotta trust his instincts, even when they tell him to do something that looks like pure foolishness." They sat their horses in comfortable silence, two successful ranchers surveying their domain. In the distance, the lights of Copper Creek flickered like fallen stars, marking the town that had grown substantially since word spread about the prosperity of the Morrison-Bradley spread. New businesses had opened, families had moved in, and the railroad was already surveying a route that would connect the growing community to the wider world. Think Harrow knew what he was setting in motion when he hid that journal? Bradley wondered. Jake considered the question seriously. I think Ezekiel Harrow was a lonely old man who wanted to believe his years in the desert meant something. Maybe he figured if he couldn't enjoy the treasure himself, at least he could pass it on to someone who'd use it to build something worthwhile. Well, he succeeded there, Bradley said. This spread employs 30 men now, and their families are putting down roots in Copper Creek. Schools, churches, businesses, all because a broke rancher was desperate enough to buy land nobody else wanted. As they rode back toward the ranch house, Jake reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. Sarah would have been proud of what he'd built here, he thought. She'd always believed in his ability to make something from nothing, even when he'd lost faith in himself. The porch light glowed warmly as they approached the house, where Frank Carson was waiting with the day's reports and tomorrow's plans. Miguel Santos had already headed home to his own small spread, carved from the northern section of the original property and thriving under his careful management. "Got a letter from that lawyer in Denver," Frank reported, handing Jake an official-looking envelope. "Says the railroad wants to buy right-of-way across our South Range, offering good money, too." Jake opened the letter and whistled softly at the figure mentioned. 20,000 for right-of-way. Bradley peered over Jake's shoulder at the letter. That's more than most spreads are worth entire. "Times are changing," Frank observed. "Railroads bringing civilization to the territory, whether we like it or not. Question is, do we want to be part of it or get run over by it?" Jake folded the letter carefully, his mind already working through the implications. The railroad would bring markets closer, making their cattle operation even more profitable. But it would also bring more people, more complications, and the kind of scrutiny that successful men sometimes preferred to avoid. "What's your thinking?" Bradley asked, reading the uncertainty in his partner's expression. "I'm thinking about a conversation I had with Ezekiel Harrow's ghost," Jake said with a wry smile, "about whether a man builds something for himself or for the folks who come after." A distant rumble caught their attention. Not thunder this time, but the sound of multiple horses approaching fast. Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, old habits dying hard even in peaceful times. The three men positioned themselves where they could see the approaching riders while maintaining access to cover if needed. "Easy, boys," Tom Bradley said as the riders came into the circle of lamplight. "That's Sheriff Daniels and his deputy. Probably just checking on reports of that cattle rustling down near Willow Creek." But Sheriff Daniels' face was grim as he dismounted, and his deputy kept scanning the darkness beyond the porch as if expecting trouble to materialize from the shadows. "Evening, gentlemen," Daniels said formally. "Sorry to bother you so late, but we've got a situation that concerns your operation." "What kind of situation?" Jake asked, though he suspected he wouldn't like the answer. "Body turned up in Copper Creek today," the sheriff continued. "Old prospector named Jeremiah Voss. Been shot 3 times in the back and left in an alley behind the Silver Dollar Saloon." Frank Carson straightened, recognizing the tactical implications immediately. "That's not random violence, Sheriff. Man gets shot in the back 3 times. Somebody wanted him dead for a specific reason." "That's what we figured," Daniels agreed. "Especially since Voss was asking questions around town about the Morrison spread. Seemed mighty interested in how a broke rancher could afford such impressive improvements in such a short time." The 4 men exchanged glances, each understanding that their carefully constructed new life might be about to unravel. Jake had always known this day might come, the day when someone started asking the right questions about the source of his sudden prosperity. "What kind of questions?" Bradley asked carefully. "The kind that suggest he knew something about Ezekiel Harrow and what might have been buried on this land," the sheriff replied. "Bartender heard him mention Confederate gold and a map that old Harrow supposedly left behind." Jake felt his blood turn to ice water. If Jeremiah Voss had been asking about Harrow's treasure, his murder meant someone else was now pursuing the same lead, someone who was willing to kill to protect their interests. "Sheriff," Jake said slowly, "I think we need to have a conversation about some things that happened here a few months back, things that might explain why someone would want Jeremiah Voss dead." "I was hoping you'd say that," Daniels replied, "because right now, you and your partners are the only connection I've got to a murder that's got the whole town spooked." They moved inside the ranch house, where the lamplight was brighter, and their conversation couldn't be overheard by anyone who might be lurking in the darkness. Jake poured whiskey for everyone, then began the careful process of explaining how he'd come to own 800 acres of supposedly worthless land and transform it into one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. "So, you're telling me," Sheriff Daniels said after Jake finished his story, "that Carson Blackwood and his gang were after Confederate gold that Ezekiel Harrow had buried somewhere on your property?" "That's right," Jake confirmed. 40,000 in double eagles, taken from a Union payroll train during the war. Harrow spent 20 years looking for it after he buried it to keep it from falling into enemy hands. "And you found this treasure and used it to finance your ranch improvements," the sheriff continued. "Legal salvage," Frank Carson interjected. "No different than finding a lost mine or a cache of nuggets. The original owners were long dead, and the gold was abandoned property." Sheriff Daniels rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "I'm not questioning the legality of it, Carson. What concerns me is that if Jeremiah Voss knew about the treasure, others might know too. And if they think there's more gold buried on this land, they'll come looking for it," Bradley finished. "Exactly, and they might be willing to kill anyone who gets in their way." The implications settled over the room like a winter fog. Jake had thought the danger ended with Blackwood's death, but apparently the gunfighter had shared his knowledge with others before making his final attempt on the treasure. "Any idea who might have killed Voss?" Jake asked. "Working on it," Daniels replied. But the man was careful to cover his tracks. Professional job, by all appearances. Voss was shot with a rifle from long range, probably by someone who knew his movements well enough to set up an ambush. Miguel Santos chose that moment to return, his horse lathered with sweat and his face dark with concern. "Patron," he called out as he burst through the door, "we have big trouble. Someone has been at the canyon, digging where we found the strongbox." The 5 men looked at each other with the shared knowledge that their peaceful evening had just become something far more dangerous. "How many?" Frank Carson asked, already reaching for his rifle. "Hard to say in the darkness," Miguel replied, "but I count maybe 6 horses, and they brought shovels and picks. Professional treasure hunters, not random drifters." Jake felt the familiar weight of his Colt against his hip and realized that his days as a simple rancher were over, at least temporarily. Someone had learned about Harrow's treasure and decided to claim it for themselves, never mind the fact that Jake and his partners had legal title to the land and everything on it. "Sheriff," Jake said formally, "I'm requesting your assistance in removing trespassers from my property, armed trespassers who may be connected to the murder of Jeremiah Voss." Daniels nodded grimly. "Consider it official business. But we're going to need more men if we're facing 6 armed treasure hunters. I can have 20 cowboys here in an hour, men who know how to handle themselves in a fight. And I know the canyon better than anyone," Jake added. "If we move fast and smart, we can trap them in the same place where Blackwood made his mistake." As the men prepared to ride out into the darkness, Jake reflected on the irony of his situation. He'd found the Confederate treasure and used it to build something worthwhile, just as Ezekiel Harrow had apparently intended. But the gold's legacy of violence wasn't finished with him yet. Some treasures, he realized, carried a price that extended far beyond their monetary value. Tonight, he and his friends would discover whether that price was worth paying. The canyon lay shrouded in moonlight and shadow as Jake's force approached from 3 directions, moving with the careful coordination of men who'd learned to trust each other's judgment. 22 riders in total, ranch hands, neighboring cowboys, and Sheriff Daniels, with 2 deputies, all united by the understanding that claim jumpers and murderers had no place in their territory. Jake positioned himself on the eastern rim, where he could observe the treasure hunters' activities below. Through field glasses borrowed from Frank Carson, he counted 7 men working by lantern light around the site where Harrow's strongbox had been buried. They'd made considerable progress, excavating a pit nearly 10 feet square in their search for additional caches. "Persistent bunch," Tom Bradley whispered, settling beside Jake with his rifle ready. "Must really believe there's more gold down there." "Maybe there is," Jake replied thoughtfully. "Harrow's journal mentioned the strongbox, but 40,000 in coins wouldn't require a chamber that large. Could be he buried other things as well." The possibility that they'd missed part of the treasure added urgency to the situation. If these men found something that Jake and his partners had overlooked, it would complicate any legal proceedings that might follow. Sheriff Daniels had positioned his men to block the main exit from the canyon, while Miguel Santos led a group of vaqueros to cover the narrow trail that wound up the southern wall. Frank Carson commanded the largest group, positioned where they could provide covering fire if the situation turned violent. Jake studied the treasure hunters' operation through his field glasses, noting their professional equipment and coordinated movements. These weren't desperate drifters or opportunistic claim jumpers. They were organized, well-funded, and probably experienced in this kind of work. "Time to announce ourselves," Jake decided, cupping his hands around his mouth. "You men in the canyon, this is private property, and you're trespassing. Throw down your weapons and come out peacefully." The response was immediate and hostile. Rifles cracked from multiple positions as the treasure hunters took cover behind the excavation equipment and returned fire toward the canyon rim. Jake and Bradley flattened themselves against the rocks as bullets whined overhead. "So much for the diplomatic approach," Bradley muttered, working the lever of his Winchester. The firefight that followed was brief but intense. The treasure hunters had chosen their position poorly, trapped in the canyon bottom with limited cover and no easy escape routes. Sheriff Daniels' men controlled the main exit, while Miguel's vaqueros aid any attempt to climb the southern trail suicidal. Frank Carson's voice boomed across the canyon with the authority of a man accustomed to commanding troops under fire. "You're surrounded and outgunned. Last chance to surrender before we start shooting to kill instead of just keeping your heads down." One of the treasure hunters, apparently their leader, called back with defiant bravado. "We know about the Confederate gold, and we know there's more buried here. Split it with us, and we'll call this even." "Already found the gold," Jake shouted in reply. "Spent it on cattle and improvements. If you're looking for easy money, you're about 3 months too late." "You're lying," the leader replied. "Jeremiah Voss had a copy of Harrow's map, and it showed 3 different burial sites." That strongbox was just the beginning. Jake exchanged glances with Bradley, both men realizing that their situation had just become more complicated. If Voss had possessed a more complete version of Harrow's map, it explained both his murder and the presence of these professional treasure hunters. "Even if that's true," Jake called back, "this is still my land, and any treasure on it belongs to me. You want to negotiate, throw down your guns, and we'll talk." The leader's response was another volley of rifle fire, followed by something that made Jake's blood run cold. One of the treasure hunters had found what appeared to be a second iron ring set into the rock face near the original excavation site. "Well, I'll be damned," Bradley breathed, watching through his own field glasses as the men below began clearing debris from around the newly discovered cache. Looks like they might have been right about multiple burial sites. Jake made a decision that would have seemed insane 3 months earlier, but now felt like the only rational choice. "Cover me," he told Bradley, then began working his way down into the canyon using a route that would bring him close to the treasure hunter's position. "Jake, you fool!" Bradley hissed, but it was too late to stop him. Moving with the stealth that frontier life had taught him, Jake descended through a maze of rocks and crevices until he was within 20 yards of the excavation site. From this position, he could see that the treasure hunters had indeed found a second cache, larger than the first and apparently still sealed. The leader of the group was a man Jake recognized from wanted posters, Dutch Cassidy, a professional outlaw who specialized in robbing banks and stealing from mines. The kind of man who would murder an old prospector without hesitation if it served his purposes. "Cassidy," Jake called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "This is your last warning. You and your men mount up and ride out, or we're going to settle this the hard way." Dutch Cassidy spun toward the sound of Jake's voice, his rifle already coming to bear. But Jake had chosen his position carefully, and when Cassidy fired, the bullet sparked harmlessly off the rocks above Jake's head. Jake's return shot was more accurate. Cassidy stumbled backward with a curse, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. The wound wasn't fatal, but it ended any illusion that this confrontation would conclude peacefully. "Take him," Cassidy snarled to his men, and suddenly the canyon erupted in gunfire from multiple directions. Jake found himself pinned down behind a boulder that seemed to shrink with every bullet that struck it. Above him, his friends were returning fire, but their angle made it difficult to target the treasure hunters without risking Jake's life in the process. That's when Miguel Santos proved why Tom Bradley trusted him with the most dangerous assignments.
De jonge vaquero had werkt his way down the canyon wall met de silence van een Apache scout, positioneren zichzelf behind the treasure hunters' main group. His rifle spoke 3 times in rapide successie en 3 van Cassidy's men viel voor de anderen zich realiseerden dat ze werden aangevallen van achteraf. Behind us, one of the surviving treasure hunters yelde, spinnend te face deze nieuwe threat. Maar Miguel had al reeds nieuwe posities gevonden. Juist de roks en schaduws te remijnen invisibel wanneer hij continu picking off targets. Dutch Cassidy, wounded en desperate, maakte een finale gamble. Poele een stick van dynamite van zijn zadelbags, hij lit de fuse en prepareerde te throwen tot Jake's positie. De explosie zou bijna half de canyonwall instorten en probabel iedereen binnen 50 yards. Maar Cassidy was past caring about collateral damage. Jake zag de sputtering fuse en realiseerde hij had per haast 3 seconden te actie. Drowen zijn colt met vloeiende motie, boeren van maanden van practice, hij fired eens. De bullet strook de dynamite stick juist als Cassidy droog back zijn arm om te throwen, detonerend de explosieven in his hand. De blast echode door de canyon like thunder, gevolgd door het rumble van vallende rocks en de schreeuwens van wounded men. When the dust cleared, Dutch Cassidy was dead, along with 2 of his men who'd been standing too close when the dynamite exploded. The surviving treasure hunters threw down their weapons and emerged from cover with their hands raised, all fight knocked uit van hun door de violentie van de explosie. Sheriff Daniels and his men quickly took the survivors into custody, while Jake and his partners surveyed the damage to the canyon. The blast had sealed the second cache, probably forever, burying whatever Ezekiel Harrow had hidden there beneath tons of fallen rock. "Might be for the best," Tom Bradley observed as they stood looking at the rubble. "Some treasures are more trouble than they're worth." Jake nodded, thinking about Jeremiah Voss and the price that greed had extracted from too many men. The Confederate gold had found had him a new life, maar het had ook violentie en dood aan zijn peaceful valley. Misschien was it time to let sleeping dogs lie. As they rode back toward the ranch house in the pre-dawn darkness, Jake realized that his treasure hunting days were over. Hij had alles wat hij nodig had. Goede land, loyale vrienden en de satisfactie van bouwen iets waardoor met zijn eigen handen. De goot was een middel tot een doel, niet een eind in zichzelf. What do you think Harrow would say about all this? Bradley asked as they crested the ridge above the ranch. Jake considered the question seriously. Ik denk hij zou zeggen dat de rechtertrui niet het goud was alleen. Het was de kans om te starten over, te bouwen iets dat zou laatsten behonzen levens.
Below them, the lights of their ranch house glowed warmly in the darkness, surrounded by the evidence of honest prosperity. Corrals filled with quality horses, pastures dotted with cattle, and the solid buildings that housed the families who'd chosen to make their lives in this valley. Ezekiel Harrow's gold had made it all possible, but it was human determination and friendship that had made it worthwhile. And that, Jake Morrison reflected, was a treasure that no amount of violence could ever steal away.